Hollywood has always loved pushing boundaries, but some sci-fi films didn't just push, they bulldozed through the line and sent censors into panic mode. These weren't just movies, they were treated like loaded weapons, too shocking or too subversive to unleash without heavy edits. But why did some of these films get branded as dangerous while others got a free pass? Buckle up, because the stories behind these films are wilder than the plots on screen. THX 11381971. George Lucas wasn't always the safe, galaxy-spanning juggernaut we know from Star Wars. His debut feature, THX 1138, was a cold, suffocating nightmare of a future where human emotions are crushed under a dictatorship of drugs and surveillance. Imagine a world stripped of color, identity, and love, where people exist only to work and obey. That's the bleak playground Lucas built before he was forced into fun space fantasy. The film followed Robert Duvall as a man who dares to fall in love in a society where desire itself is illegal. His rebellion is quiet but explosive, and it terrified Warner Brothers executives. They thought audiences would reject its hopeless tone and drug-controlled citizens, so the studio hacked it up, slashed entire scenes, and dumped it with barely any promotion. Lucas himself was devastated, calling it mutilated. Ironically, the movie's supposed flaws are what make it unforgettable. The sterile white visuals, the oppressive sound design, and that gut-punch ending all served as a warning. Freedom can be erased without a single shot being fired. Critics later praised it for daring to go darker than most sci-fi dared. Today, THX 1138 stands as proof that even George Lucas once made films too radical for Hollywood's comfort. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. When Warner Brothers brought Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange to American theaters, they knew they had a powder keg. This wasn't space opera or robot adventure, it was a cold-eyed dystopia that dared to link futuristic youth culture with lawlessness. Malcolm McDowell's Alex wasn't a villain you hated. He was charming, funny, terrifying, and disturbingly magnetic. That combination lit a fire under every critic and censor who saw it. American reviewers warned the film might encourage real-life violence. Politicians ranted about the glorification of brutality. Some theaters faced protests, while watchdog groups insisted it would corrupt young viewers. Kubrick's hyper-stylized violence, paired with classical music, looked almost too seductive for comfort. Warner Brothers debated pulling it from circulation in certain states. The irony is that Kubrick was critiquing society, not encouraging chaos. His central question, do we lose our humanity when the government takes away our ability to choose, was buried under the outrage. Audiences didn't walk out reflecting on morality. They walked out debating whether this film should even exist. In America, it survived only through controversy, and its dangerous reputation cemented its place in pop culture. Today it's studied as one of the boldest sci-fi experiments ever released, precisely because it scared the system. Westworld 1973. Before Jurassic Park warned us about corporate theme parks gone wrong, Michael Crichton gave us Westworld. Imagine a luxury playground where robots serve your every fantasy until they stop following the script and start killing the guests. That premise sounds like a box office dream now, but in 1973 it was a studio nightmare. The idea of machines turning on their makers felt too plausible, too close to headlines about new computer technology. Yul Brynner's gunslinger robot, with his stiff movements and soulless stare, became the prototype for every killer cyborg that followed. But back then, critics called him too frightening for audiences. Censors complained about the nihilism. Executives worried it painted technology as a monster just when the public was learning to embrace it. Some theaters refused bookings, fearing negative press. The funny thing? Westworld looks tame compared to modern blockbusters, but its DNA is everywhere. The Terminator, The Matrix, even HBO's reboot owe it everything. At the time, though, it was written off as dangerous, not because of gore, but because it forced viewers to ask what happens when machines get smarter than us. Decades later, that danger feels less like science fiction and more like a warning label for our own AI future. Altered States, 1980. When Ken Russell took Paddy Chayefsky's novel, altered states to the screen, studios braced for controversy. This was not a popcorn-friendly science fiction romp. It was an experimental descent into the human mind, mixing hallucinatory visuals with primal chaos. William Hurt played a scientist obsessed with unlocking ancient consciousness through isolation tanks and strange substances. And what he found wasn't enlightenment, it was regression. The imagery was so intense that audiences staggered out of early screenings complaining of nausea. Religious groups screamed blasphemy. Scientists dismissed it as dangerous nonsense that might inspire reckless experimentation. Studio executives even fought with Russell, terrified that the film's sensory overload and grotesque transformations would tank its release. Instead of pulling back, Russell pushed harder. He filled the screen with lava flows of color, bodies morphing into prehistoric shapes, and sequences that felt like waking nightmares. Some critics admired its audacity. Others called it reckless filmmaking. Altered States ended up polarizing audiences, but its reputation as a film that dared to step too far only grew. In hindsight, it wasn't dangerous because of its science. It was dangerous because it showed just how fragile the human mind really is when pushed past its limits. RoboCop 1987. Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop wasn't just a sci-fi action flick. It was a grenade lobbed at corporate America, government corruption, and the very idea of law enforcement as hero worship. But it wasn't the satire that had censors sweating, it was the carnage. The original cut was so brutal that the MPAA slapped it with the dreaded X rating, usually reserved for underground films. We're talking about scenes where bodies exploded into unrecognizable pulp, gunfights drenched in blood spray, and a man melted by toxic waste before being splattered across a windshield. Studio executives begged Verhoeven to tone it down. He cut frame after frame of gore just to sneak it into theaters with an R rating. Yet RoboCop's real danger wasn't just its blood. It was the mirror it held up to America in the late 1980s. Corporate executives laughing while ordinary workers suffered. A city policed by machines because human systems had failed. Commercials inside the film selling war like a product. Critics dismissed it as ultra-violent trash, but audiences saw the bite beneath the bullets. Today, RoboCop is hailed as a masterpiece, proof that sometimes a movie is called too dangerous, not because of the violence, but because of the truth hiding under the splatter. They Live, 1988. John Carpenter's They Live wasn't filled with aliens shooting lasers or epic space battles. Its danger came from something more subversive, telling audiences that the real villains were already running the world. When a drifter named Nada slips on a pair of sunglasses and sees billboards screaming, "Obey" and "Consume," it wasn't just science fiction. It was a middle finger to consumer culture and unchecked capitalism. Carpenter shot it cheaply, but his message was so sharp that it freaked out studio executives. Politicians and critics accused it of pushing anti-American propaganda. News outlets dismissed it as paranoid nonsense. And yet, underground audiences devoured it, passing around VHS tapes like contraband. The infamous 6-minute alleyway brawl between Roddy Piper and Keith David, one of the longest fights in cinema history, wasn't just ridiculous spectacle. It symbolized the brutal resistance against blind conformity. What terrified the system wasn't the rubber-masked aliens. It was the film's suggestion that people were being manipulated every day, trained to stay asleep. Too many viewers saw reality in the metaphor, and that made They Live a problem. Even Carpenter admitted it cost him jobs in Hollywood, calling it his most dangerous film. Today, memes of OBEY and the sunglasses gag are everywhere. What was once seen as dangerous paranoia now looks like eerily sharp social commentary. The Thing, 1982. You'd think John Carpenter was trying to sabotage his own career with The Thing, a remake of a 1950s monster flick. But instead of a rubber-suited alien, he unleashed the most grotesque practical effects horror had ever seen. In Antarctica, an alien life form that can perfectly mimic any living creature rips through a research team, leaving audiences guessing who's human and who's already infected. Sounds like classic sci-fi suspense, right? Not in 1982. Critics savaged it, calling it disgusting and nihilistic. Test screenings went poorly, with viewers recoiling from the transformations, dogs splitting open into monsters, torsos turning into fang traps, heads sprouting spider legs. Universal executives panicked, and the movie flopped. Carpenter, once riding high from Halloween, suddenly found himself unemployed by the same studio that hired him. The real danger wasn't the gore, though. It was the paranoia, the thing stripped away trust, showing how quickly humans collapse when fear takes over. Cold War audiences weren't ready for that mirror. The studio buried it, only for fans decades later to crown it a masterpiece of suspense and practical effects. Back then, the thing was considered too much. Today, it's considered too perfect. The Terminator, 1984. Before Arnold Schwarzenegger was a pop culture catchphrase machine, the Terminator was considered a grim nightmare. James Cameron pitched it as a slasher film disguised as sci-fi, with an unstoppable machine hunting a young woman through the night. The difference? This killer wasn't just evil, it was inevitable, a walking metaphor for humanity's doom at the hands of technology. The MPAA initially wanted to slap it with an X rating for violence, particularly scenes of police massacres and relentless killings. Critics worried that its cold, machine-like violence would inspire real-world copycats. Studio executives didn't see a franchise, they saw a liability. Orion Pictures barely marketed it, treating it like low-rent pulp, but audiences connected. The stripped-down story of survival, mixed with Cameron's nightmarish vision of a mechanized future, hit nerves everywhere. The danger wasn't just the gore, it was the idea that no matter how fast you run, the future still finds you. In hindsight, calling it too dangerous feels laughable given its sequels and pop icon status. Yet in 1984, The Terminator was the kind of movie studios didn't want to own. It was too bleak, too sharp, and way too relentless. Terminator 2, Judgment Day, 1991. If the first film was treated as pulp trash, its sequel became a cultural earthquake. Terminator 2 was a blockbuster that redefined sci-fi, but it wasn't without its controversies. Critics complained about the hyper-realistic violence, especially with kids in the audience watching playgrounds vaporize under nuclear fire. Some watchdog groups demanded edits, calling it a danger to impressionable teens. The real spark came when the film's imagery started popping up in darker contexts. Trench coats, firearms, and the idea of ordinary people turning into unstoppable machines drew attention from schools and politicians. It was accused of glorifying violence, despite Cameron layering in themes of humanity and redemption. Even so, T2 walked a fine line, too dangerous for some, too visionary for others. The irony? Its cutting-edge effects made the destruction look more believable than anything audiences had seen before. That realism terrified censors, but thrilled moviegoers, turning it into one of the highest-grossing films of the decade. Decades later, it's remembered not as a threat, but as one of the greatest sci-fi achievements ever. Yet, in its moment, T2 was seen as a blockbuster that maybe looked a little too real for comfort. Fire in the Sky, 1993. Not every dangerous sci-fi movie comes from gore or violence. Fire in the Sky earned its reputation for something else: pure terror. Based on the true account of logger Travis Walton's alleged abduction, the film built itself as a straightforward drama until one sequence sent audiences over the edge. The abduction scene remains one of the most disturbing in sci-fi history. Walton, paralyzed, is dragged through a cold alien ship, stripped of control, and forced onto a surgical table where bizarre beings experiment on him. The imagery was claustrophobic, tactile, and so vivid that people fainted during test screenings. Theater owners in some regions even pulled the film after complaints that it was too traumatizing for general audiences. The marketing leaned into its true story angle, which only made things worse. Parents argued it would scar children. Critics dismissed it as manipulative shock. Paramount realized too late that they had a film that audiences couldn't handle in one sitting. Fire in the Sky didn't bomb completely, but its reputation as a too terrifying to release sci-fi story grew instantly. Today, that abduction sequence is still ranked as one of the most frightening depictions of alien contact ever filmed. Sometimes danger doesn't come from violence. Sometimes it comes from making your worst nightmare feel real. Strange Days, 1995. Directed by Catherine Bigelow and produced by James Cameron, Strange Days wasn't your typical mid-90s sci-fi. It was a neon-soaked trip into the final hours of 1999, where people used black market tech to relive other people's memories. Ralph Fiennes played a washed-up dealer who stumbles onto a recording of a brutal crime, and suddenly the film wasn't just science fiction, it was a time bomb. The danger, its themes, police corruption, racial tensions, voyeuristic addiction. Strange Days tackled them all head-on. Critics warned that its violent imagery and pointed commentary were too incendiary for mass release. Some theaters pulled back marketing campaigns, and box office numbers cratered. Bigelow's ambitious vision was dismissed as too disturbing, too political, too raw for audiences who just wanted Millennium Party movies. But under the chaos was sharp foresight. The film predicted the rise of body cams, the danger of surveillance, and society's obsession with consuming other people's lives through screens. The squid recordings, shown in dizzying point-of-view shots, made viewers feel like participants in crimes and desires they couldn't stop watching. That was exactly the problem. Strange Days forced audiences to question their own appetite for spectacle. At the time, it was branded dangerous and buried. Today, it feels like prophecy. Starship Troopers, 1997. On the surface, Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers looked like a big glossy bug-shooting adventure. But beneath the explosions and pretty faces, it was biting satire. A society that glorifies military service. Propaganda reels telling you to enlist. High schoolers cheerfully marching into intergalactic war. Many viewers missed the sarcasm and thought the film was celebrating fascist ideals. That misunderstanding turned it into one of the most controversial sci-fi releases of the 90s. Critics accused it of being pro-military brainwashing. Schools pulled discussions of it from curricula. Political groups attacked Verhoeven for supposedly endorsing the very things he was mocking. Some screenings were met with protests, and its U.S. box office underperformed despite flashy marketing. The real danger was that audiences weren't used to blockbusters that asked them to question patriotism itself. Verhoeven even insisted he made the film to expose how propaganda can make war seem fun. The over-the-top violence, the eerily cheerful commercials, even the beautiful cast, all were deliberate tools to show how easy it is to sell destruction as entertainment. But nuance gets lost when your movie features giant insects tearing people in half. Starship Troopers was dismissed as too dangerous, too confusing. Years later, it's celebrated as one of the sharpest satires Hollywood ever snuck into multiplexes. Event Horizon, 1997. If Alien was sci-fi horror with restraint, Event Horizon was sci-fi horror with no breaks. Directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, the film followed a rescue crew investigating a ship that vanished into another dimension and came back possessed by something unspeakable. What audiences got was a descent into interstellar hell. The original cut reportedly ran over 2 hours and featured scenes of extreme gore, bodies torn apart, glimpses of mass torture, and a literal vision of hell spliced with nightmare imagery. Test audiences panicked. Some walked out. Paramount demanded cuts so severe that Anderson later admitted whole reels of footage were destroyed. What survived was still terrifying, but fans whispered about the lost footage that was too shocking for release. At the box office, it underperformed. Critics trashed it as exploitative, but the legend of the original cut grew. Fans dubbed Event Horizon The Shining in Space, and its reputation as a dangerous film only deepened with every rumor of missing footage. What made it dangerous wasn't just the gore, it was the idea that Hollywood once filmed something so disturbing. The studio buried it for good. Today, the theatrical version has cult status, but its true horror remains locked away. The Matrix 1999. It's hard to believe now, but The Matrix wasn't always the beloved classic it is today. When it first dropped, government officials and watchdog groups worried it was inspiring all the wrong people. The black trench coats, the idea of rebelling against a system of control, the glorification of high-tech weaponry. Suddenly, it wasn't just a movie. It was a manifesto in the wrong hands. The infamous bullet time shootouts and the imagery of Neo mowing down guards drew direct criticism. Schools reported students mimicking scenes, dressing in black leather, and quoting, "There is no spoon." Politicians warned it was too violent for teens. After certain real-world tragedies, the film was re-examined with suspicion, accused of fueling dark fantasies. The Wachowskis hadn't intended it as a call to arms, but its philosophy was sharp enough to be misread. The irony? The Matrix was always about choice, about breaking free from illusions, not destruction for its own sake. But when a film inspires copycat imagery and headlines, the label "too dangerous" sticks fast. Instead of sinking it, the controversy helped the movie grow into a phenomenon. Its mix of philosophy, groundbreaking visuals, and cyberpunk rebellion changed cinema forever. Dangerous? Maybe. Revolutionary? Absolutely. The Interview, 2014. Danger in sci-fi usually comes from gore, violence, or wild ideas. But The Interview proved that sometimes danger comes from outside the theater. A satirical sci-fi comedy about assassinating a dictator, the film was pulled from major release after hacking threats and real-world warnings that screening it could spark international conflict. For the first time in modern history, a Hollywood studio treated a comedy as a national security risk. Sony Pictures canceled its theatrical run after major chains refused to show it. Government officials weighed in. News outlets debated whether Hollywood had bowed to censorship by force. Viewers who did see it online or in limited screenings found a goofy, uneven comedy. But by then, the actual film hardly mattered. The Interview had become bigger than itself, a symbol of free speech, global tension, and how movies can ripple beyond entertainment. Was it truly dangerous? No more than any other satirical sci-fi flick. But in the atmosphere of cyber threats and political pressure, perception was everything. The Interview will always be remembered not for its jokes, but for the chaos it stirred. In the end, the danger wasn't in the film. It was in how seriously the world took it. So, what makes a sci-fi movie truly dangerous? Is it buckets of gore, mind-bending ideas, or the way a story taps into fears we're not ready to face? Each of these films was treated like a threat, cut, banned, or buried, because they struck too close to home. But that's also why they lasted. Sci-fi at its best doesn't just entertain, it unsettles. It makes you question. Which of these films do you think really deserved its dangerous label? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden stories from cinema's wild side.